So we are continuing today in Maseches Peah, Perek Zayin, Mishnayos Beis through Gimel, chapter 7, Mishnayos 2 through 3. Mishnah Beis says as follows: Zayis shenimtza omed bein shalosh shuros shel shnei malabnim. So remember again, we were talking about chapter 7 introduced us to the idea of the concept of shechicha as it applies to olive trees, or trees in general, but specifically now to olive trees. So here's the situation. Imagine you have the following case. You have an olive tree that is halacha l'maisa. You have 3 rows of olive trees, and then you have an olive tree in the middle of the middle row, in the middle of that row. So again, 3 rows of olive trees, right? Each row with 3 trees, and now we're talking about the middle tree of the middle row. Ushacho, and what happens? So the owner forgot to go ahead and harvest this tree. Eno shechacha. Ultimately, again, it's not shechacha. Now, the reason ultimately, again, it's not shechacha. Now, by the way, the Mishnah also adds in over here, shnei malabnim. Shnei malabnim means that there's 2 strips of land that are separating in between these 3 rows. So therefore, again, you forgot to harvest the middle tree of the middle row. The Mishnah says it's not shechacha. Now, why is it not shechacha? Because the assumption is that halacha l'maisa, the reason you forgot to harvest it is not because you forgot about it, but simply because it was obscured or hidden by the other trees around. In other words, since this is the middle tree in a pretty dense olive tree area, we assume the forgetfulness is because you didn't see it and not because you actively forgot to harvest it. If you have an olive tree that has 2 saw of olives and you forgot to go ahead and harvest it, it's not shechacha. So I will say this is in conformance with what we mentioned before, that anytime you have a volume of 2 saw, that's a significant amount, and therefore will not count towards shechacha. So also remember again, in the previous Mishnah we said that if an olive tree has what we call a shem, a unique name, right? Bishmo. So ultimately again, salacha l'maisa, right? We saw mishmo, b'masav, u'b'mkomo. So what does it mean when the olive tree has a name that halacha l'maisa doesn't become shechacha? Or when do we say that if it has a name it doesn't become shechacha? Bizman shelo hischil bo. That's only if halacha l'maisa you never started harvesting that tree. Aval hischil bo. But if you started to harvest that tree, even though it has a shame, it has a unique identity. Afilu kizayis hanatufa b'shaito. Even if it's called the zayis hanatufa, the tree that flows, that allows olive oil to flow from it, ushachacho, and you forgot to finish harvesting it, yesh lo shechacha. Ultimately, again, it is subject to shechacha. In other words, the exemption of a tree that has a distinct name from the halach of shechacha is only if you never started harvesting it. But if lamaisi you started harvesting it, then enachinami, under those circumstances, it becomes shechacha. Kozman sheish lo tachtav yesh lo berosho. As long as there are still olives underneath the tree, in other words, olives that fell from the tree that a person is still going to gather, as long as those olives are there, anything left on the tree can't yet become shechacha, because the presence of the olives on the ground tethers you to the tree, and therefore it's not going to become shechacha. Meir says, Meir says, in fact, it's even more than that. Apparently, in olive harvesting, what would often happen was as follows. You'd harvest the olives from the tree, you'd collect the olives that fell off the tree, and then there'd be a guy who would come and shake the trees afterwards. Right? He would shake the trees. So Meir says, it's only halacha l'maisa. It's only halacha l'maisa after the machve, after the guy who searches literally again for the hidden fruit. Right? He would shake the tree, bang on the tree. The Bartanura says, so only once he comes is anything left on the tree going to be considered shechacha. Beautiful. Mishnah Gimel, Ezehu Peret. So now we're transitioning to the halachos of Peret. Peret refers that when a person is going ahead and when a person is picking his clusters of grapes, so if grapes fall to the ground, then halacha l'maisa, that's called peret. You have to leave it for the aniyim. Say, ezuhu peret, hanoshe b'shas habetzira, if grapes fall off the vine at the time you're harvesting the vine. Hayabotzer akatz esa eshkal huspach ba'alim v'nafam yodol aretz. So listen to this case. Let's say a person is harvesting his grapes, and he goes ahead and he cuts down an eshkal, a cluster of grapes. And then what happens? The cluster goes ahead and gets tangled in the vine. As a result of getting tangled to the vine, grapes fall to the ground. Or for that matter, again, the cluster falls to the ground. Vinifrat, and grapes get separated from the cluster. So now you have grapes that fell to the ground. What's the halacha? Harehu shabalabayis. The grapes, interestingly enough, are not peret, but rather, again, they belong to the balabayis, they belong to the owner. They belong to owner. Now, the reason they belong to the owner ultimately is why? Because halacha l'maisa, the way that parrot works is if you're going ahead and you're harvesting something, you're harvesting the clusters, and during harvesting the grapes fall off, that's parrot. But if you're pulling off the clusters from the vine and the cluster gets tangled in something else, that's not the case of parrot, and therefore again the grapes still belong to the balabayist. Last part of the Mishnah says halacha l'maisa hamaniach hasakal kol hatachas hakeven b'shas shubo. It's an interesting case. What happens if somebody places a basket underneath the grapevine as he's harvesting the grapes? He's doing this obviously to catch any grapes that fall, prevent them from becoming parrot. Hariza gozel asaniyim. He's stealing from the poor. Stealing from the poor. In other words, the Torah says whatever falls on the ground belongs to the aniyim. And ultimately, again, to put a basket there to catch everything, that's not right. Al zeh ne'emar al taseg gvul olim. About this, the pasuk says literally again, do not encroach on the boundary of the poor. So by here, you're encroaching on the boundary of the poor by putting the basket and collecting the grapes that fell. All right, stop over here for today. Wishing everyone a wonderful day.